Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. This episode continues our series on dollarization, a core policy of the CPSI for reinvigorating economic dynamism in the Caribbean. On today's show, lessons from Ecuador with economist and key policy driver Francisco Zalles. He gives us his account of the process towards bringing the dollar to Ecuador, the pushback, the challenges, and the underlying rationale for shifting one of Latin America's most tumultuous countries to the greenback. It's all here, and what I think is one of our best discussions yet on dollarization. Be sure to check out our previous episodes on dollarization linked in the show notes. Without further ado, on to the show. So, Francisco, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast live in Madrid.
And welcome. Well, thank you very much, Rashid. I'm very happy to be here. Yes, in Madrid. Just got back from Canary Islands where I filled my courses for Universidad de las Perias, and I gave the inaugural lecture this year.
Okay.
It was a huge honor. So thank you for having me. I've always been a big fan of your podcast, and I'm very happy to be here.
So we are going to do a deep dive into dollarization in Ecuador. And this comes up, constantly when you bring up dollarization anywhere in the world. There are so few countries that have done it. So the models that have done it, people tend to even not know that much about in any really sophisticated way. And that's why I want to fill in with this episode. Because even me, there are lots of details about the dollarization process that I'm not aware of in Ecuador that I'm happy to finally get a chance to ask someone who was there and part of the plan. So that's where I want to start. How did you get involved with the idea and process and just the essentially idea promotion of dollarization in Ecuador?
So I was a very young economist, but there was only one liberal think tank, and I was associated with it. It's called the Instituto Ecuadoriano de Economía and Política, still run by Dora de Ampuero. When I showed up there as a young economist, Dora put Mises and Hayek in my hands for the first time and really changed my life because I'd come from a very formal economics background and was very not happy with it. There was something lacking. So I'd been working with the Instituto Ecuadoriano de Economía and Política, and there was a major banking crisis. I was also working for a bank, and it was a member of the economic committee of the Private Banking Association. So I was looking for solutions, and we were looking for solutions out of the Instituto Ecuadoriano de Economía and Política. And Franklin Lopez and I were working on a variation of Simon's banking fractional reserve, et cetera, which was, I thought, was the way to sterilize the excess money that was coming into the system. Then José Luis Cordero, a friend and also liberal, came to Ecuador, and he wanted to reissue his book on currency boards for Venezuela in Ecuador. So he asked me to revise and actualize it. But at the time, we're talking about 1998, there was already a lot of noise on the Argentine convertibility, which was not a currency board, but most people absolutely have no idea how different they were.
Right.
So Ecuador was already in dire straits going into a banking holiday, basically. We ended up in a banking holiday. And I just thought it was a really bad idea to try to sell currency boards at the time. Ecuador had already looked at the currency boards in 1995. That was my first exposure to them, really.
Mm.
So I just thought, look, there's got to be a better way. And someone at the table, and I think it was most likely it was Dora, said, well, why are we using a currency board? Why are we proposing a currency board that actually gives power to the central bank still when we could just take the reserves and give them to the people? And sort of light bulb went off and everybody said, and he said yes. And as a result, I was the co-author of the first book that came out of dollarization with José Luis Cordero. And then my research was also used in Franklin Lopez's book, which came out a few months later, which is How to Dollarize Ecuador. How did I get involved? Through liberal ideas, through finding ways to make sure that the people had the power and not the government.
So the banking crisis in Ecuador that essentially accelerated the push towards dollarization is pretty infamous now. But we were talking earlier, Why did this crisis come to a head at this time?
It's incredibly important. Thank you, Rashid, for that question, because unfortunately, the narrative has been completely overtaken by, I'm going to say Korea. That's the narrative that's out there because they have insisted forever, and they still do. They bang the table on the corrupt bankers when Korea's expenditures and Korea's, completely money, profligacy, whatever the word is actually magnitudes larger than the banking bailout. If you consider a banking bailout, because banks actually lost. But anyway, getting to your point, in 1998, Ecuador suffered a very strong El Nino. Banks had a major concentration of loans into the commodity sector because Ecuador is a major commodity exporter. However, here's an interesting point. Ecuador has a price control on bananas. So the government, through price control on bananas, actually created an incentive for an excess of banana production, which the banking sector loaned into. So there's a huge concentration of loans in the banana sector, and bananas and shrimp collapsed during the Niño because of an external shock. This created a liquidity pressure on the banks. Simultaneously, Ecuadorian banks were streamlining into the Basel Accords. It was the only time that Ecuadorian banks have ever been under international norms of banking. In order to take banks that had normally been running wild and put them into real course, that also puts pressure on the balance sheet. So as pressures on the balance sheet were taking place because bad banks or weak banks were having to fess up on a whole bunch of stuff that they were free to do before, the Niño falls. And various banks start asking for emergency loans from the central bank. So the central bank during 1998 actually loaned up to a significant amount of the GDP. I forget exactly the number, but there were emergency loans out in 1998. So there was a lot of liquidity that had been printed and sent. So the central bank wanted to soak up that liquidity somehow. The existing banks who had a lot of pressure because interbank rates obviously had gone through the roof. And the government wanted to finance itself at the same time because it had a lot of fiscal pressures going on. So the government decided and passed a law to change taxation. They actually got rid of income tax and substituted the income tax with a tax on financial transactions. 1% tax on financial transactions. So if you went and you deposited money, 1% was taken off. If you took your money out, even through an ATM, 1% was debited from your balance. Now, how does that work? As you as an economist understand, for money to multiply itself, for M1 to turn into M2, we need loans and deposits. So if you put a tax on transactions, on loaning and depositing, you're contracting the money supply. You're demultiplying the money supply. So this law came into effect in early December, but would be applicable 1st January. What the central bank did was increase reserve requirements. It doubled reserve requirements on dollar deposits on December 18th. And in January 18th, it increased reserve requirements in sucres by 33%. Keep in mind that interbank rates were already in triple digits. So the central bank basically caught a small smoldering fire and threw 3 gallons of gasoline in it. So by 8th March, there was a banking holiday.
What was the rationale for the central bank to increase the reserve requirements?
To this day, we don't know. I've had conversations with friends of mine that were working in central bank. I actually almost lost a lot of friendships because once I heard about that, I picked up the phone and I actually got very upset at them and I raised my voice at them. And I told them very clearly, you will be responsible for the downfall of the Ecuadorian banking system. And they were like, well, you can't raise your voice to me like that. And we're still friends. We've become friends. And they've said that I was right. But of course, that's not any consolation because 100% of the banking sector was frozen. Deposits were frozen for a year. And this created a very serious condition for Mahuad, who became highly unpopular. So they started unfreezing deposits as quickly as they could. But every single time that they unfroze deposits, the sucres at the time would pressure the exchange rate. So the exchange rate started creeping up, and they could not control it. Central bank had zero credibility, couldn't control the interest rates, FX rates. So the economy was really in a tailspin. The only thing that was keeping the economy, if you want to call it keeping the economy, was the fact that the whole economy was frozen for 9 months. But that's essentially the genesis of the Ecuadorian financial crisis. It was caused by poor coordination and very bad policies from the government and from the central bank. Case in point, the superintendent of banks at the time, Jorge Egas, was impeached. And I'd already floated this theory. I'd already written about the fact that it was the central bank's fault. So he asked me to write the defense for his impeachment, and he was exonerated. So to this day, if you think about the Ecuadorian banking crisis historically, there is no responsible party. The narrative is that the bankers were at fault. But if the bankers were at fault, where is the evidence? Where is the supervisory authorities that should have on top of it? Why are they not at fault? Now, I'm not trying to excuse the banks. There were bad apples. There was especially one really bad apple in the Ecuadorian financial system. And this is called Banco del Progreso, and the owner was Fernando Aspiazu. And what he tried to do is to use and exacerbate regional tensions between the highlands and the lowlands. And the government was from the highlands, Quito. And Guayaquil is where most of the banks that were affected by the external shock in the commodities, they were the most affected. So there was this tension that was historical in Ecuador between the capital and was used as well by this bank. As a matter of fact, that bank, which was the largest bank in Ecuador at the time, was not intervened directly. He shut his doors. He placed himself into a receivership of his own. It was only later that the government actually took over the account. And sure enough, his bank had concentrated loans into his own companies that exceeded the permitted amounts by 5 times. So the rest of the Ecuadorian financial system had been complying with the Basel Accords, had been reducing their exposure to related companies significantly. They had better capital adequacy ratios than Peru, Panama, Colombia, than most of their peers. So the Ecuadorian banking system was complying, was getting better. It was hit by an external shock. Then, of course, you can't compete against the central bank and the fiscal authorities just throwing a dumpster fire on you. So that is the genesis of the Ecuadorian banking holiday. It's central bank irresponsibility combined with fiscal irresponsibility.
The crisis continued, and the president at the time, Jamil Mahuad, he wasn't particularly responsive to dollarization at the beginning. And then it was a shock. He actually came to TV to announce dollarization quite suddenly. Why do you think he decided to essentially Hail Mary his presidency by dollarization, if that's a fair categorization?
Absolutely. His popularity when he announced dollarization was 7%. The whole country, and this is in the memoirs of the central bank bureaucrats that actually worked with him after dollarization, said everybody expected him to resign. So why did he Hail Mary? Because that was his only option. And that was because we'd done a significant amount of legwork convincing people. There was also Joyce de Ginata, who recently passed away. She had this political platform that we were able to capitalize on in order to convince the population that this was a solution. And how we did that was very methodical. Both Franklin Lopez and I would go to every single university, every single opinion maker, and instead of having a one-on-one publicly, we'd have one-on-ones privately. And we'd say, look, we're not here to confront you. We're here to say, this is our idea. What is yours? It was a Socratic method that basically convinced people. We created this coalition of left, right, and center that eventually would publish, and we'd put press releases saying, this is what Ecuador needs to do to get back on track. So his Hail Mary was because fundamentally he was up against the wall. He had absolutely no other options. And this was already popular. This was already ingrained in the people. People were telling him, dollarize, why don't you dollarize? We had sent him various proposals to dollarize. So he was hearing it from the people. He was hearing it from inside his cabinet, but he'd been very not favorable to it. As a matter of fact, I think I showed you, there's a famous telex sent to the financial system of Ecuador on the 5th of January saying dollarization is completely off the table. Well, dollarization took place 4 days later.
Right.
So why did he Hail Mary it? Was because he wanted to survive politically. A president with 7% popularity announced the intention to dollarize the economy. There was absolutely nothing but an intention. The spontaneous order worked so fast, and this is in all the memoirs, it caught everybody off guard how fast it worked. By the next morning when banks opened, there was absolutely not a single call to the central bank to buy dollars. Lines on the banks were over. Interest rates started dropping. Jamil Mahuad was kicked out of office 12 days later. There was a coup 12 days later. By then, his popularity had risen to 17%. That's how fast dollarization worked in his favor. But what I want to illustrate here is that 12 days later, Ecuador was still dollarized, even though all that was sustaining it was the announcement by a president with 7% popularity. That's not the government working. That's the spontaneous order working. And that's the strength of dollarization. It actually returns the power of money and the value of savings back to the individual. It takes it away from the politicians.
When you were discussing and promoting the de-dollarization, what kind of group of person was most opposed to it and who were more receptive to it?
Oh, obviously the central bank.
Hmm.
The central bank was opposed to it. The IMF was opposed to it publicly. There were 2 economic think tanks that were very opposed to it. And of course, there were extreme left-wing political organizations that were opposed to it. However, I actually had public debates with them. I still respect these people a lot because I don't respect Correa. I don't respect his people because they're a different breed. But the true Marxists, the true believers, some of them are very academically honest. And when people are academically honest, you can hold a conversation. And we would literally go to auditoriums and have a one-on-one debate. And they were against it and we were for it. So they were clearly against it, but their arguments were weak. Why? Because there was a massive financial crisis. So the obvious question was, this is a solution, what's yours? And there was no answer on the other side except more of the same. And more of the same is just not acceptable. I won't say it's easy. We went to each university and talked to opinion makers and talked to professors. And we published manifestos in the Ecuadorian paper where you look at the names, and it's funny because it's a complete coalition of people left, right, and center saying, this is a solution, the government should consider it. So it's the only time in Ecuador that really leftist economists have actually proposed market-friendly measures. It was in the fact that there was this banking holiday, this major crisis, and there was this void of ideas to get us out of it.
So you mentioned just now that the only thing that really sustained the dollarization early on was just an announcement. There was no law, there was no regulation, there was nothing beside this statement by a very unpopular president. But how then did it stabilize?
So he did issue a decree, but he was out of office 12 days later. How did it stay place? Was because it was so popular. There was a poll the day after he dollarized, it was already 52% popular. So it already had a majority. Although most people were uncertain about what this was. Within 1 week, interbank interest rates went from 151% to 25%. Within a week, the remunerated deposits in the central bank, liabilities in the central bank, went from 91% to 9%, the equivalent of T-bills, we'd say. So deposit rates, which were high, started coming down. Loan rates went from 73% to 16% in a month. So this is what maintained it. What maintained it was that it was just working, that it was just fantastically popular because everybody could breathe a sigh of relief finally. And there was another additional, I think, factor. The banking holiday had frozen deposits in sucres. And every time that the FX rate went up, those deposits in sucres lost value. So if you dollarize the economy, those frozen deposits were dollars by then. So everybody was in favor of it, except the indigenous population of Ecuador had already risen up in arms against Jamil Mahuad because even before the banking holiday, or when he declared the banking holiday, he took away some subsidies in gas and fuel because he really wanted to have an accord with the IMF. He was begging the IMF to give him money. This was the way for him to get out, to tie himself to the IMF, which we didn't do. We went through dollarization, and they were very much against dollarization. But if you read Stanley Fischer's speech 6 months after dollarization, he says, we were shocked and surprised at how well it has worked. But had they asked us, we would have said no. And informally, we know that they asked them, and we know for a fact that they said no,
Right.
because the representative in Ecuador, his name was Jeffrey Franks, whom I actually had lunch with afterwards. And as Jeffrey Franks was leaving the country, I asked him, well, what are you going to do next? He says, well, I'm going to go dollarize countries. Why did it stay? Simply because it worked. 12 days afterwards. So who really throws Mahuad out of power is this indigenous coalition that marches in Quito. But of course, they were against the gas subsidies being lowered, against Mahuad. Then Mahuad decides to dollarize on 9 January. So the whole manifestations turned into, we're also against dollarization. So 12 days later, when he's thrown out of office, one of the cries is down with dollarization. So, of course, there's a president with zero credibility who's just been thrown out of office by a coup, and the coup promoters are saying no against dollarization. Still, interest rates stayed stable. Still, there was no pressure on the central bank. So the incoming vice president that had already seen 12 days of stability, that understood that everything was okay, and was getting calls from everybody saying, don't move this, don't move this. The only people that are against this are the indigenous uprising. He said, no, we're keeping it. And the uprising left. They fizzled out as they normally do, and dollarization stayed. Now, dollarization's popularity has increased significantly every single year. By 2015, it was 85%. The latest polls put it at 88.9% popular.
So I'm going to fast forward a bit. You might come back also, but we're going to fast forward a bit because I want to spend some time talking about Rafael Correa.
Oh, gosh.
So Rafael Correa, former president of Ecuador, he is a trained economist. He was an economics professor.
Yeah.
And he was the minister of finance before he was president. And from the beginning, he was anti-dollarization.
Yes.
Quite strongly. I recently, preparing for the interview, I saw a paper he wrote in 2004. I think he was just still a professor at that time, not even governor at all. And he was talking about how it's very bad for Ecuador, how we need to get past it. And Rafael Correa, he was, I guess one could say, the most popular politician in Ecuador in recent memory. And he wanted to get rid of dollarization, but he couldn't do it either. So I want to spend some time on this. Why is Correa so anti-dollarization? And then later, why couldn't he get rid of it?
Well, I met Correa when he was a professor. I was dollarizing, and he was already an anti-dollarizer. And as I said, I'd already had various open auditorium debates with anti-dollarizers. So I asked him to have a debate. Now that he's been ex-president, he's very insulting, but he comes after me on Twitter. And I keep on saying, and if he's listening, let's have a debate, Correa. Why is he anti-dollarization? Because he's a strong believer that monetary policy can be used to increase social spending. He believes that dollarization only benefits the richest in the economy. He's an anti-capitalist. He does not believe in the market. And he did absolutely everything to undermine dollarization. For dollarization to work optimally, you would have an open economy. You would let dollars flow in and out without trying to trap them. This is the Panamanian model. What he did was totally the opposite. He tried to close the economy and close capital flows in Ecuador. He installed capital controls, and he also very wildly, immediately after he assumed office, declared a default, even though he had significant petroleum income. So Ecuador's default under Correa was merely to shut Ecuador out of capital markets. Then he installed a whole bunch of mercantilist policies. He changed the Constitution. The Constitution is basically a blueprint for the socialism of the 21st century. It's not a constitution. It's 444 articles that give the president and a whole bunch of, the government basically runs all of Ecuador. There is no possibility, for instance, Ecuador is under blackouts right now, but the only investor in electricity generation in Ecuador by law is the government. This was put in the 2008 Constitution. So Correa is a believer, or I think he's more politically expediently believes that he could maintain his political clientelist, populist political agenda if he had money to spend. And he did. He had the petroleum, and he spent all of the petroleum. As a matter of fact, for the first 8 years of dollarization, Ecuador had surpluses. Yeah. So as soon as Correa gets into power, he turns those surpluses into chronic deficits. Why did we have surpluses, amongst other things? Because we passed a fiscal responsibility law. I think it's absolutely necessary. It's definitely a great idea that if you're going to have a monetary anchor, you should have a fiscal anchor with it. So we passed in 2002 the first fiscal anchor law, and actually I wrote it. The fiscal anchor law provided for a stabilization fund. So surplus petroleum above what the petroleum price was budgeted at would go to this sovereign fund, and that sovereign fund would help fund whatever. First of all, it would bring down debt up to a level of 40%, and then that it would help for deficit volatility, and what was left over would help social spending in the economy. But of course, if you can maintain a 40% debt level, then there's a tremendous amount of availability for social spending once you've stabilized the patient. Correa immediately, when he was in 2005, when he was finance minister, the first thing he said was that was ridiculous, because what needed to be emphasized and prioritized was social spending and social spending and social spending. And nobody's against social spending, but you need to be able to pay for it. So Correa got immediately into trouble with the World Bank in 2005 when he was shortly lived as a Minister of Finance because, amongst other things, he went around this fiscal responsibility law, and the World Bank withheld payments on their next loan. That got him chopped off. That cost him the Ministry of Finance. And 2 years later, he was a candidate. And by 2008, he took away the fiscal responsibility law, and Ecuador went from surpluses to chronic deficits to the largest deficits in Ecuadorian history. The deficits are caused in order to promote his populist agenda and to leave and saddle the next generations and the next politicians with such a burden of debt that Ecuador is not able to crawl out of it. So first of all, he installs a default to close off the country from foreign financing. Then he installs capital controls. He starts a capital control tax for foreign transactions. He says it's temporary. It's going to be spot 5%. It's at 5% now. So Correa did absolutely everything. As a matter of fact, once he ran out of petroleum revenue, once petroleum corrected in 2014, he actually found a way to take reserves out of the central bank. There's a study by the IMF that says that the amount of money that he took out of the central bank was equivalent to 10% of the GDP of Ecuador. The guy did absolutely everything in his power to destroy dollarization. But dollarization is so popular that he knows. He'd come out and say, dollarization is the worst thing in the world, but we're not going to get rid of it. Because he couldn't, because it would cost him, definitely political votes. And it has. None of his candidates after his presidency, after it came to light that he had been dipping into the central bank, which made him more unpopular, have actually won the presidency. So there's evidence that people are rejecting his model more and more because the dollarization put guardrails on him.
So I'm going to tap into that. But before I do that, Mahuad, would you consider him a liberal or a free market person in some way?
That's a hard question to answer. I would say he's a social democrat and a weak social democrat at that, which is probably the worst combination that you can have in a politician in Ecuador, because it's, yes, some market reforms, but not really. And therefore, when they fail, they get completely identified as free marketers when they're not really. I do think that he's smart enough to know that you can't go against the market and that there's prices that have to be. And he did do some very pro-market friendly measures, like, for instance, attempting to get rid of the gas subsidies that have saddled Ecuador with an incredible burden for many years. And by the way, a lot of the subsidized gas actually gets sold in Peru. It goes over the border to subsidize Ecuadorian, Peruvian consumption. So I think he does have a market-friendly attitude, but he's your typical social democrat. Let me give a more recent example. Macri in Argentina. They're trying to balance way too many variables by trying to stay popular. At the end of the day, you need to take some serious decisions, and you need to ideologically align yourself with one or the other. You're either going to go full market or you're going to go full Marxism. And the reason why political parties in Latin America, Marxist political parties in Latin America, have been so successful is because they're so clear with their ideologies. Most social democrat parties like Mahuad's are wishy-washy. They're not fully committed to a path, and therefore they end up failing. And when they fail, they get wrongly associated with truly market. They're market-oriented, if you will, but they're not really market-convinced.
And Korea, obviously, who was a socialist, it is interesting because Ecuadorian population voted for Korea. They really liked him. He was so popular, they were able to change the constitution. But that same population always also very pro-dollarization. So usually people always tend to think, oh, it's a very free market ideology, dollarization, but you can't really say Ecuador is a free market ideology.
Not at all. Not at all. And it's historical. Dollarization is an exception to Ecuador's history. However, it has lasted longer than any constitution in Ecuador's history. Ecuador is a very volatile and completely adolescent politically. Dollarization is liked, but it's not understood at all. Ecuador is a highly mercantilist economy since the 50s. The government, it's fundamentally a socialist economy. It's socially planned, it's centrally planned, it's mercantilist, it's protectionist. What Correa did was just exacerbate that, add populism, add authoritarianism, really deepen the protectionist and the closing of the borders. His argument was very deceiving. What he told the people was, an economy needs money to run, which is correct. In his case, it was Ecuador needs dollars to run. But truly, the argument is any economy needs money to run, right? So that's a tautological statement, and people bought that. Of course they bought. But then he built that into a logical fallacy. He said, therefore, we need to lock the dollars in. We can't let the dollars out. And so people were like, okay, the one thing makes sense, the other thing makes sense too. Instead of saying, we need to open the economy so more dollars can flow into it. This is what he did. So he convinced people that we had to close the economy in order to save dollarization. Okay? He really convinced them that what he was doing was the best thing for dollarization. And unfortunately, he drowned out many, and all of us, everybody. By then, every single economist understood that dollarization was a good thing, except Correa and his followers. So absolutely, Rashid, Ecuador is not, by any stretch of the imagination, a market-friendly economy or a population that is steeped in the fundamentals of the market, because they've not even been exposed to it. And what they've been sold consistently is that capitalism is an exploitation theory. They still believe in the exploitation theory of the capitalist. And one of the reasons that that has been so ingrained is precisely because of the banking crisis that you just mentioned. For over 20 years, they've been talking about the financial crisis and how the bankers were corrupt and how the bankers took everybody's money, when really the bankers that went broke and all the money was put back in the depositors' pockets. So they've managed to take over the narrative. We've seen this in many other places. This is politics that takes place everywhere. But as a population, the average Ecuadorian citizen is not aware, has never been aware. Ecuador has never privatized a single institution, not a single one. It's never experienced true openness of an economy. So they don't even know what they're against. They're just accustomed to this, and therefore they're extremely socialist in their organizational thought structure, and it's a hard thing to get through.
One of the strong arguments usually used for pro-dollarization is that dollarization creates a fiscal straitjacket on the government so they can't overspend in the economy. But you had mentioned that Korea found a way to still spend in dollarization. Could you explain how that happened?
Yes. Okay, so we call dollarization a pre-commitment strategy, right? And this is why it's so strong, because it commits the current politicians and the future politicians from being able to spend. And the reason I bring this up is because my current and Yip's current strategy, not strategy, but we're starting a campaign to close the central bank of Ecuador. What we did in Ecuador was we took away the capacity to print money, but we didn't close the institution where you can create money. Central banks can still create money, even though they don't print money, when they expand their balance sheet. And this is what Correa did. You can even think of it as a modified quantitative easing by telling the government-owned banks to say, well, why don't you issue a promissory note and I'll just buy it from you. And so he kept on pumping money into the government-owned banks based on his social spending agenda. And this expanded the bank. And then, of course, you deposit it in the central bank. So the central bank increases its assets and increases its liabilities simultaneously. So accounting-wise, it looks balanced. But the truth is that once people start using that money, the balances of the reserves in the central bank start dropping. So he consumed the reserves of the central bank. By 2014, he drops the whole I'm doing this through government banks facade, and he passes a new monetary law by which the central bank starts financing the Ministry of Finance directly, starts financing the deficit directly. Where does the central bank get the money from? From the reserves. Where are the reserves coming from? Amongst other things, they're coming from the bank's deposits. Because he closed the economy, he forced the banks to bring any deposits that they were holding abroad back into the country. So he tapped into the money of the depositors indirectly in order to keep financing his political agenda. So central banks are a very pernicious institution. They are run by a few privileged individuals that have the capacity to destroy your life. We saw that in the banking crisis. The banking crisis was created or exacerbated by a few very wrongly taken decisions by a few people. They created a banking holiday. They destroyed the Ecuadorian banking system. Then you have central bank under dollarization, a very, very, very dangerous institution to have. As a matter of fact, the only institution that can actually de-dollarize an economy is the central bank. We have a history in Ecuador where Correa was already able to abuse the central bank. We know that this is the weakest link within any dollarized economy. We've started a campaign saying, look, if you really like dollarization, which you do, the best way to strengthen it is to get rid of the central bank. And getting rid of the central bank, once again, going to pre-commitment, just strengthens the pre-commitment. It strengthens the pre-commitment and gives the individuals more certainty that it will never go away.
How would you close the central bank in Ecuador?
It's rather easy. John Greenwood, Steve Hanke, and I published a paper in November proposing the closing of the Central Bank of Argentina. It's an issuing bank is harder than closing the Central Bank of Ecuador, which is a dollarized bank. Once the bank is dollarized, it fundamentally acts like any other depository institution, and you can just wrap it up. There's two quirks that I would say, or three quirks that I've already dealt with. In the book that's going to be published by March, I deal with a very detailed account of how to close and why we should close the Central Bank of Ecuador. But there's three things, and getting into the weeds with it a little bit. Ecuador still issues coins. Mm-hmm. So you'd have to take the coins out. Liability would have to be passed on to the private sector. This can be done in the same way that Hong Kong issues the currency through banks. So that little quirk has to be taken care of. It's a minor quirk in Ecuador, and there are various ways that historically something like that has been taken care of. The Hong Kong Monetary Authority doesn't issue coin. It's a Standard Chartered Bank that issues coin. So we could easily pass that liability on to the private sector. Then there's the fact that the central bank is the major depository institution for the Ecuadorian government. It's called the Treasury account. It receives all the deposits from petroleum exports. It's the one that pays off the local governments, etc. So we just have to pass all those activities to the private sector. If it's politically unviable to give it to the true private sector, you could even use a coalition of private sector and government-run banks. But the idea would be that there wouldn't be one bank where all of these activities are centralized. And then the last part of it would be the relationships with multinationals like the IMF and the IDB and the BISD, et cetera. So those could be easily passed on to other entities within the Ministry of Finance, et cetera. As a matter of fact, what we are suggesting in our proposal is that Ecuador needs to beef up its financial supervision. So all of the talent that actually exists in the central bank, they're not all bureaucrats. There are people, there are public servants there that are talented, which are being wasted completely today. Their talent is being wasted on an entity that has no real value, that adds no value, that doesn't reduce transaction costs in the economy of Ecuador. So if we could take that talent and also coalesce a lot of the very poor institutions that Correa left over in terms of banking supervision, we should be able to set up a much stronger banking supervision authority in order to prevent crises, not to be reactive to crises. Now, the other curious thing about dollarization is that one of the things that we predicted as well is that the banks would self-police themselves. Mm-hmm. And Ecuadorian banks have much larger liquidity ratios than their peers all over South America because they know that there is no lender of last resort. However, the population has been sold the idea that there is a lender of last resort. This is one of the reasons we need to get rid of the central bank.
The Panama comparisons are quite useful here. That it is one of those other things where the information of how Panama works is so hard to find.
Unfortunately.
People don't discuss Panama that much because, over 100 years, dollarized, very open market, but yet people don't really know the nitty-gritty of how things work. In Panama, they never had central banks, but the Banco Nacional, the national bank, essentially does some of these central banking functions like managing coins and things like that. And they also manage, in conjunction with the private sector, but Banco General in particular, the RTGS and so on in Panama. So clearly this can work in reality in Hong Kong, with the example you mentioned. So one of the other things that I want to ask about is the brief Correa policy of the CBDC, the central bank digital currency that Correa had tried to implement. Was it 2008 or 9? A while ago by now. What was his intention behind that?
The intention was to de-dollarize. The man behind that is Andrés Arauz. He was his vice presidential candidate at one point. He was actually the presidential candidate for Correa. He is deeply left, and his theories are very, very flawed. He's behind the central bank digital currency, and the whole idea was that they could issue currency in a dollarized economy, and that currency would trade at equal value to the dollar, and therefore they could maintain government spending. By that time, the law allowed the central bank to finance the Ministry of Finance directly, so they could just create digital currency, pass this digital currency to the Ministry of Finance, and then the Ministry of Finance could pass the digital currency on to social spending and to local government and things like that. And then those local governments would use that digital currency to be able to purchase real goods and services. It was an absolute flop. There was no issuance whatsoever. Nobody accepted it, amongst other things, because it was immediately aware, the population was immediately aware that this was not a real currency. There was immediate backlash to them, and this was across the board. So it died. It was stillborn. There was no acceptance of the digital currency. This is a society that has very low internet penetration, that is not technologically very advanced. So for you to try to install a central bank digitalized currency in a country that does not have a penetration, although we've seen in Africa, people can use phones. So that was part of the idea, is we could use phone money, right? The fundamental reason why it flopped immediately was because it was flagged as a currency that would compete against the dollar, and nobody wants anything but the dollar. It died within a year.
So Dollarization usually, again, in the common ways discussed, is taught as a stabilization tool, is taught as a fiscal commitment tool, but it's not usually discussed as a developmental tool. And in Ecuador, there's some data that you were explaining to me earlier, but could you get into how we should think about dollarization as a developmental tool and apply it to federal distribution in Ecuador, because real world example?
Rashid, thank you for that question. That's exactly where I've been writing and developing most of my research in dollarization for the last few years. It has transcended a monetary anchor. It is an institutional anchor. It institutionalizes the private property of money. Money is an important institution in any economy, and it should be held by the individuals. Its value should not be manipulated by a third party. This really transmits power to the individual and takes it away from the politician. That's why it's a development tool, because it truly transmits the running of who is the boss of the economy, the citizen, and not the government. And that changes the dynamic significantly. What we've seen in Ecuador is that, for instance, politically, any candidate that speaks out against dollarization, like Arauz, will lose an election. The power of institutionalizing or reinstitutionalizing money is extremely important. And the reason why dollarization should be considered a significant tool for development is because it's easy to implement. You can't change institutions overnight. You can't make courts be less corrupt overnight, but you can change money overnight. When you change money overnight and you absolutely give private property its proper place in society, then the dynamic changes significantly. And that's what's been happening in Ecuador. So citizen knows, even though there's deeply committed Correa followers in Ecuador, they like the dollar. They don't want to get rid of the dollar. So we think that it's going to be easier to convince those people that what we've actually done is privatize currency. So if we privatize currency and you like it, then why can't we privatize other parts of the economy and you can also get good results for them? There is no more democratic private property than money. And building institutions is a long-term process. Dollarization is a very fast and efficient way to introduce an inclusive institution. What institutional drift tells us is that if there is a sufficiently strong, inclusive institution, there can only be two results. Either the political extractive institutions will corrupt it, or they will have to adapt to it. Dollarization, in my belief, is incorruptible for various reasons. I've studied how to de-dollarize countries, obviously, very deeply. And the conclusion that I've reached is that it's almost impossible to de-dollarize. And I say almost because Zimbabwe did it, but it's almost impossible to de-dollarize because, not because of ideological, political reasons, but because simply it is logistically impossible. Once the currency in circulation in people's pockets is the dollar, if you were to announce a de-dollarization, what would happen to daily transactions? They would collapse completely. Like dollars would disappear. And unless you have a stock of money to replace the stock of money that exists, then all of the economy would collapse rapidly. After First World War Germany, cities had to issue script in order to be able to function. First World War Germany was a much different economy than today's economies. So the mere impossibility of substituting whatever papers in circulation rapidly overnight makes de-dollarization impossible. So I would say dollarization is a cure for populism. Dollarization is truly a recipe for development, amongst other things because it installs a highly inclusive institution that cannot be corrupted by political extractive institutions. And Ecuador is a great example of this. You can throw anything at it, but eventually the politically extractive institutions will have to adapt to it.
I think that's probably the most powerful analysis one could think about dollarization in Ecuador, because the constitution changed, and yet they couldn't change dollarization.
But you got to understand that the constitution that changed in Ecuador changed all of the institutionality of Ecuador. Every single institution is subordinated to central planning. The whole economy is centrally planned. The private sector is subordinated to the public sector. The regulations are just stifling. Taxes are stifling. If you could think of all the conditions that would make a dollarization really, really, really hard, you have Ecuador. That's why Ecuador is such an interesting example, because you really have to study it from the point of view of how tough is dollarization? Well, there's Ecuador. Ecuador has every single institution and the whole political economic landscape of Venezuela. It shares exactly the same constitutional basis. It has petroleum revenue, etc. But you compare Ecuador to Venezuela, and Ecuador is 1,000 times better. Its GDP grows at 150% that of Venezuela's annually over the last 20 years. Of course, you then compare Ecuador, a dollarized economy, to Panama, where Panama doesn't share the same institutionality of the socialism of the 21st century, but it also has the dollar. And Panama does a lot better than any other Latin American institution. So you can say that dollarization will save you from Venezuela. It won't save you from the socialism of the 21st century. It will stop it. It will help you maintain certain amount of economic calculus. What ended up happening in Ecuador, for instance, and I showed you some statistics before we started, is that dollarization helps decouple the private sector from the private sector. When you have a devaluatory inflationary economy, you spend a lot of your time worrying about what a politician is going to do to affect your pocket. I ask this of the Argentines all the time. I just say, what percentage of your time are you spending worrying about the interest rate? And they're like, oh my God, 10%, 20%. Imagine if all that time, immediately, overnight, you could spend on being more productive. We're talking about GDP and potential GDP going up overnight. The deterioration of, or the elimination of this exogenous risk allows for economic calculation. And that's the basis of the economy. That's productivity. That's how you get unemployment down. It's through productivity. And so the other thing that they throw against dollarization is the rigidity of the currency will make you not competitive. So let's take the private sector of Ecuador that has been castigated by poor institutions, by corrupt courts, by crowding out from the government. Anything you can think of has been thrown at the private sector of Ecuador. But shrimp exports have grown so well that now, in today's world, 1 out of every 4 shrimp you consume comes out of Ecuador. But non-traditional exports, non-petroleum exports in Ecuador are significantly larger than petroleum exports are. All of Ecuador's balance of payments historically was based on petroleum. Now petroleum is less important than private sector exports. All of that is possible because economic calculation can take place by the private sector. So this is what stability gives you, and unique stability to be long-lasting. Dollarization is long-lasting. It's a pre-commitment that is so strong that eventually all institutions will have to submit themselves to the openness that it requires. Even though Ecuador has been closed and shut off from foreign, and from anybody that has money in Ecuador will take it out, pay the tax, and doesn't want to bring it back in, right? Why? Why would you pay a tax to bring money back in? Why would you put it under risk of all these regulations and crony capitalism, all these things that unfortunately a bad government and a socialist and planned economy brings with it? So dollarization is truly a recipe for development. If Ecuador has been able to grow under the conditions, the really bad conditions that have been set in place, imagine how well Ecuador will grow once they give it the right and proper fertile conditions for the private sector to thrive. And that's what we're hoping for in Argentina.
Earlier, you mentioned that there was a team of experts, or a particular expert that Korea had brought in to design some new fiscal laws in Ecuador, or monetary laws.
What I think what you're referring to, once Mahuad announced dollarization, they needed some sort of way of justifying that the spontaneous order had worked so well, but they were perplexed. They were like, oh, but we need a law. We need a law to make this work. And this is interesting because one of the lessons of Ecuador is that it works so well and so rapidly that they've not done the rest of the homework. And this goes to the central bank, to getting rid of the central bank, to making sure that there are fiscal anchors, to making sure that money can freely float in and out. that you have a well-regulated banking system so that there's no real risk. Like Panama, you should integrate to the rest of the world. Once you dollarize, it's the private sector that dictates how much money is in the economy. And therefore, you should just let the market decide. You should not start messing with the monetary mass because you're going to get into trouble. And this is what the Ecuadorian government has done. It's created this hybrid of dollarization on the one hand, but still discretionary monetary policy on the other hand, through fiscal means. So what ended up happening was that dollarization worked within hours, but since there's this legacy of having to legislate, of having to create government around things, they called in all these experts, so-called, I'm going to put them on quotes because they never called Kurt Schuller, they never called Steve Henke, they never called Larry White, they never even consulted with us, the locals that had been promoting and writing laws, and they never even called us to help with what's called the dollarization law. Now, the dollarization law only has about 12 articles that really deal with dollarization. It was a law that had been cooked before as a potentially modernizing law, but it didn't do anything. It absolutely didn't do anything. It was ridiculous. And one of the experts that was called in, was paid for by the IDB, was a Frenchman. And one of the things that they had to do, and this is typical of bureaucracies, they just have to justify themselves. The largest part of the articles and clauses in the new law that was passed in March had basically nothing to do with dollarization. The largest part of the dollarization clauses has to do with installing a new accounting system for the central bank, which is fundamentally an accounting system that is used in all colonial currency boards. So there's nothing new to it, but the bureaucracy that came in justified themselves by saying, oh, we have this thing that will really help. And all it really does is it creates, a new type of accounting. But if you know how to read a balance sheet and, sort of gobbledygook, that was also violated by Korea.
So I have this book here, published by Mahuad. It's like 2001 or 2, I believe.
No, 2020. Because the whole premise is that 20 years later, 20 years after dollarization, he comes out to finally say, this is how we did dollarization.
Okay. I would say I bought it in 21. So that's the issue. He attempts to describe what he says is the process where he dollarized Ecuador.
Exactly.
The title is essentially, this is how we dollarize Ecuador. You're a bit critical of this interpretation.
I'm not a bit critical. I'm 100% critical. I was an actor. I was part of it. I saw it. I lived it day to day. And if you read the book, it's absolutely sad, in a sense, that 20 years later, it's completely demonstrable that he still doesn't understand how dollarization works. So he chose the exchange rate. He arbitrarily decided that Ecuador would dollarize at 25,000. And that's been highly criticized. We criticized it the day after. The day after he announced, he said, look, we're happy you did it, but you could have done it a lot better. And you should have followed what we told you months ago. There is a market-friendly way to dollarize, and it is to tell the country that you are going to dollarize within a certain number of days. And of course, you freeze any monetary expansion during that time. Henke did it in Montenegro. This is nothing that we're making up. That's the way to, because you need to establish the most informed rate, the most informed market rate in terms of supply and demand. Because once you get the rate wrong, you're causing friction, you're causing problems. So what Mahuad did was establish a rate that was extremely high, which resulted in 91% inflation under dollarization. And just a little side note, this is precisely the concern we have in Argentina now, that the rate is so revalued that if it were to dollarize at these rates, like if they were to say, a la Mahuad, this is the rate, it would create a problem on the other end of the spectrum. You need the market to establish exactly what the demand and supply is and what is the proper rate. So I'm just using this as an example because 20 years later, Mahuad writes in his book and he says, I can absolutely with all certainty tell you that I made the right decision based on the studies that we had, which have never surfaced, that 25,000 sucres to the dollar, which is the rate we dollarized at, was the correct rate. And the reason is we were able to take out of circulation all the dollars. Well, yeah, you had an excess of reserves. That's the whole purpose of dollarization, to buy every single sucre in existence. What he's attempting to say is that there was not a single dollar left in the central bank after he dollarized. That would have been a perfect calculation. That would have been like, wow, you really got it down to the cent, that there was not a single dollar left in the central bank when you bought out your existing money in circulation. Every single sucre in circulation was taken out by dollars, and in the central bank, there was not a single dollar left in the central bank. Then you got that calculation absolutely correct. But that's totally what did not happen. There was over $300-400 million left in the central bank, and we're talking about a monetary base of only $800 million. So he really screwed the pooch. And in his announcement, he said, our studies indicate that 25,000 is the correct rate, and inflation next year will be 10%. Inflation next year was 91%. So the studies that he mentions in his book, which he never publishes, even though it's like a 1,000-page book, where is the link to this study? Nobody has ever seen this famous study. We did studies in the private sector. We had all the studies. We drafted laws that we sent to them. They never took us into consideration. And so these studies that he says 20 years after the fact that they had are bunk. They didn't exist. Why did he choose 25,000? Dollarization took place on a Sunday, 9th of January. 31st of December, when all fiscal accounts close, is where we take stock of what happened. And the exchange rate was at 18,400, more or less. In 5 days, between then and the 5th of January, the exchange rate went to 25,000. So it lost 7,000 out of 18,000 basically in value, very rapid. We were going into a hyperinflation. The rate that he chose was the spot rate after a massive spike. Instead of even thinking the market has overreacted here, which is normal, he took the spot rate. That's it. That's what he did. And he has no justification for it. And it was a mistake. And that mistake cost Ecuador dearly, because inflation did not come back down to single digits until after 2 years after dollarization. But here he comes 20 years later with the most important institution in Ecuador's history, and of course he wants to jump on the bandwagon. As a matter of fact, if you talk to a lot of Ecuadorian economists today, they keep on saying, well, I was part of dollarization. Well, no, you weren't. It is such an important institution in Ecuador's history that of course everybody wants a piece of it. I can demonstrate just how many fallacies are in this book, and it's upsetting, quite frankly, that even the title, he says, this is how we dollarize Ecuador. Well, you didn't. Thank you, though. You took the decision. I mean, he could have gone the other way. He could have created another banking holiday and could have taken away people's deposits. So in that sense, I think we should give him due praise in the fact that he took the right decision. But he didn't take it because he had this study and he knew exactly what he was doing. No, he took it because it was a political lifesaver for him. He was kicked out 12 days later. He's been declared a pariah. He's been sued. He can't go back to Ecuador, which is very sad because I think he should be allowed to go back to Ecuador and face the court of public opinion and defend his position. But this is his defense for dollarization. It is the weakest defense I have ever seen. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that even 20 years later, he doesn't understand how dollarization works, or that his exchange rate, his choice of exchange rate, was wrong. And that's pretty telltale.
You mentioned that you're working on a book yourself about proper interpretation of dollarization process in Ecuador.
So the IEP, the Instituto Ecuadorian Economist and Professor, has not, in the last 25 years, published our version of the history of dollarization. We've been cautious about reading other people's interpretations and waiting for the right time. So dollarization turns 25 on the 9th of January. The longest lasting constitution in all of Ecuador's history did not turn 23. It lasted from 1906 to 1929. So it is absolutely clear now that dollarization is the most important institution in Ecuador's history. So it is important that other countries understand this and see this, because with that evidence, it cannot be underestimated as a tool for development, as an institutional anchor that can truly change a country. And this is what we're going to publish. We wanted to publish it earlier, but we think it's going to come out in March. Steve Hanke has a chapter, Kurt Schuller has a chapter, Larry White has a chapter, and of course, all the important economists that help with dollarization in Ecuador, Dora, Pablo Lucio Paredes, Franklin Loeb, myself, we have chapters in the book. And of course, I've written the historical part. We look at dollarization as an event study too. We try to make it as objective as possible in terms of the data that we present as to how dollarization took place. We give a lot of references. We inject our analysis. We show that the Central Bank of Ecuador, what they did, this hasn't been published before. We believe it's a very important tool for students of dollarization. And I have a chapter there where I propose the closing of the central bank, and I put a very detailed plan on how to do that. Because we think that if dollarization has been the most important institution in all of Ecuador's history, and you want to strengthen it, then this is the single most important thing to strengthen the pre-commitment of dollarization. So look out for that book coming out. We don't have a title yet, but I think we're going to call it something like Dollarization, a vaccine against populism. Or my favorite, which is a book that I had been writing for a long time, I've basically incorporated into this, Dollarization, a recipe for development. The strength of what's happened in Ecuador, the evidence of what's happened in Ecuador, just cannot be overlooked. And unfortunately, it has been. Most people don't know about Ecuador, have never heard of Ecuador, but it is the first country in the world that voluntarily gave up its currency that had been in circulation for over 100 years and said, "We're done with you, central bank. You have not provided us with a service that has brought down transaction costs. You have only increased transaction costs in this economy, and you have created winners and losers, and you've made a lot of people rich, not by productivity, but by inflating currency, by creating devaluation. So we're done with you, central bank, and give the power to the people." This is an important step. This had not taken place before in monetary history. So what we're missing now is to close the central bank. And I hope to have the next podcast with you as the liquidator of the Central Bank of Ecuador.
Francisco, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
It's been my pleasure, Rashid. I mean, honestly, thank you very much for all your work on dollarization. I think that there's a lot of things that we still have left to talk. Maybe we could have another one sometime soon.
Definitely.
But dollarization and money are the most important institution in a society, and we need to pay more attention to it. And especially in countries that have low institutionality, we need to get rid of the central bank, which is basically a factory for misery.
Thanks.